What do you picture when you hear the word port? A huge area where megaships arrive from the sea and unload thousands of containers, right? A port simply can't be anything else. Or so you'd think. In Nevada, they've started building a massive port for ocean freight right in the middle of a dry, dusty desert. Right here. Yes, you heard that right. No ocean, no seagulls, not even some miserable little river nearby. Just scorching sand, thorny bushes, and suddenly a seaport. It sounds like the insane idea of some billionaire or a mistake in the blueprints. Why would anyone build a transfer hub for ships in a place where no ship could ever possibly sail? That's exactly what we're going to figure out today. If you open a map of the world, the Pacific Ocean looks like one enormous empty space between Asia and America. Just water, right? A ship is like, I need to get there, turns around and sails off. But in fact, that's not how it works at all. Right now, the ocean is one of the busiest and craziest trade routes on the entire planet. All year round, thousands of massive vessels move through it in such a dense stream that it looks less like open water and more like a giant factory conveyor belt that never stops. Ships are leaving China, Vietnam, and South Korea in a non-stop stream, heading straight for the U.S. So basically, all the things being transported are supposedly sold in America. But in fact, they first spend a long time crossing the ocean inside millions of steel boxes. These are the most ordinary 20-foot containers, the kind you've seen 100 times. And every year, tens of millions of these boxes arrive in the United States. It's just an insane amount of metal. These containers carry almost everything that keeps everyday life going. One might be full of brand new iPhones and computers, the next packed with millions of sneakers, while others are carrying auto parts or even plain old toilet paper. The entire American economy now critically depends on this ocean conveyor belt. If this system suddenly jammed up for even a couple of weeks, that's it. Customers could say goodbye to their orders. Store shelves would start going empty and factories would simply shut down because without these boxes, the system doesn't work. And where exactly does this unimaginable mountain of metal and goods actually arrive? Nearly half, or more precisely, about 30% of all containers headed to the U.S. arrive in one single place. On the West Coast, there are two neighboring ports sitting right next to each other, Los Angeles and Long Beach. These ports are very different from most others in the U.S. Everything there is built with cutting-edge technology. The shipping channel is extremely deep, so even the bulkiest vessels don't have to worry about running aground. Modern robotic cranes line the docks, grabbing these massive metal boxes from the decks. Everything moves, buzzes, and gets unloaded at incredible speed. On paper, it looks like a perfect machine. A ship arrives, it gets emptied, the boxes are neatly stacked on shore. What could possibly go wrong? But the moment that steel box touches American soil, the whole system starts to break down. The problem is that around these ports, there aren't any huge empty fields where millions of containers can simply be spread out. What surrounds them is dense California urban development. Residential neighborhoods, office buildings, and regular city roads all around. There's very little free land, not nearly enough warehouse space nearby, and the roads around the ports are simply too narrow for that volume of cargo. In other words, the containers are taken off the ship quickly, but then they just get stuck on land. They just sit there, waiting for a regular truck or train to come and pick them up. And that truck first has to crawl through city traffic, reach the terminal, collect the container, and then somehow squeeze its way back through the same roads. Trains can run into problems in situations like this too. The problem is that cargo moves out by land much more slowly than the cranes unload it. So containers start building up on the shore, and the ports basically choke themselves with cargo they don't have time to clear. And that raises the question, if the situation on the West Coast was so problematic, shouldn't it have led to some kind of logistics collapse? And in fact, it did. Things got so bad that, in fact, pretty much everyone felt the impact. It happened in 2021 at the height of the coronavirus pandemic. Here's the basic idea. Americans were stuck at home in quarantine with not much to do. They couldn't go to restaurants or the movies, but everyone had internet access and bank cards with money on them, so they started buying everything they could from online stores. New bikes, sofas, TVs, and tons of random stuff from Asia. And this insane flood of goods all started moving toward the ports of Los Angeles at the same time. And that's when the already stressed onshore system simply choked. Storage yards filled up completely, literally to 100% capacity. Steel boxes were stacked on top of each other, almost up to the sky. Eventually, the situation became completely absurd. The massive robotic cranes were ready to work. The ships were docked at the berths, but the containers couldn't be taken off the decks. Why? Because there was physically nowhere to put them on the ground. Huge warehouses deeper inland were also packed with goods. Trucks and trains were bringing containers there from the port, but unloading them was simply impossible. As a result, a historic traffic jam formed off the coast of California. Only it wasn't made of cars, but of massive ships. More than 100 giant container vessels were just anchored in the open ocean for weeks, waiting for people on shore to clear at least some space. Captains looked at the port through binoculars, but there was nothing they could do. In other words, the incredibly powerful logistics system of the United States ended up partially paralyzed simply because right next to the shore it had run out of free space. The ships were there, the goods were there, but there wasn't a single extra patch of land available. That was the trap they fell into. It's clear that as consumers, we may not receive our goods on time because of congestion at the Port of Los Angeles. But how does the person who paid to have that cargo shipped to the U.S. react? The reaction there was simple. The cargo owners were practically tearing their hair out because at that point they were almost crying over the bills piling up. Here's the basic idea. A port isn't some free parking lot at a shopping mall. It's insanely expensive land on some of the most valuable coastline in the country. And for every day your steel box just sits on the dock taking up space, that port starts running a ruthless meter. Usually you get a couple of free days so you have time to send a truck and pick up your cargo. Didn't make it because of traffic jams or a shortage of drivers? That's it, you get fined. And you're also paying several $100s a day for every single container. Now imagine a major company with thousands of containers stuck in that port bottleneck. They were losing millions of dollars every day simply because their goods weren't moving. Business owners started grabbing their heads and thinking, wait a second, why the hell are we paying premium prices to store containers on some insanely expensive coastline? We just need a place to put them temporarily. After all, the metal box couldn't care less where it sits while it waits its turn. It doesn't need an ocean view or resort weather. It could just as easily sit somewhere in a completely different region, far away from crowded port cities, where there's plenty of empty land and the rent costs next to nothing. So how do you solve both the container congestion at West Coast ports and the company's massive storage costs? With a port in Nevada, a state that doesn't even have access to the sea. Yes, you heard that right. A port in the desert, where tumbleweeds fly around instead of seagulls, and there's nothing but sand all around. It's called an inland port, and it's actually being developed near the small town of Fernley, right in the middle of Nevada. Officially, the project is called the Port of Nevada. Here's the basic idea. This isn't a port in the usual sense. You won't find any ships, sailors, or docks there. In fact, it's a massive transshipment hub in the middle of the desert where containers arrive by train to be stored and sorted. So why did they choose this particular spot in Nevada? Two main factors came together here: rail lines and very cheap land. Fernley is a railroad junction where the routes of two major American rail giants, Union Pacific and BNSF, come together. In other words, the tracks were already there. They didn't really need to start from scratch. And most importantly, the area is surrounded by endless empty desert. Land there's incredibly cheap, so instead of cramming everything into a tiny patch of space by the coast, the Americans simply paved over huge concrete yards in the sand, covering an area the size of hundreds of football fields. They installed the same kind of powerful cranes and built huge modern warehouses. In simple terms, the system works like this. A very long freight train arrives, a crane quickly lifts the metal boxes off the train and places them on the ground, and the containers just sit there neatly in rows without getting in anyone's way. As a result, the desert has become a perfect mega hub. Containers can stay in Nevada for as long as needed, while cargo owners avoid paying massive port storage penalties. But how does this whole system actually work in real life? Where exactly are all these containers being brought from into the desert? And how does this help the West Coast and the ports of Los Angeles? Right now, this entire system is already up and running in the Port of Oakland in the San Francisco Bay Area, California. It used to work like this. A ship arrived in Oakland, dropped off its containers, and they just sat on the waterfront. Then thousands of trucks came to pick them up and slowly dragged them east along the massive clogged I-80 freeway. Traffic on the road was a never-ending nightmare. Trucks choked the air with fumes, and the logistics teams were tearing their hair out over the delays. With the port, the process looks completely different. In Oakland, containers are transferred straight from the waterfront onto the rails, and the train rushes full speed toward Nevada. No hours-long highway gridlock, no unnecessary chaos. But what does the West Coast as a whole, and Los Angeles in particular, have to do with it? The entire coastal logistics system works like one living organism. Once Oakland got the ability to send freight by rail to Nevada's dry port, it stopped draining extra resources from the rest of the network. The region's transport system got a little more breathing room, warehouses in California became slightly less overloaded, and that made life easier for neighboring ports as well. But the Americans aren't planning to stop with Oakland. Now that the model has proved itself, they're planning to connect the same dry port in the desert directly to those notoriously problematic ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. The idea is to create routes from the docks of these southern giants straight into Nevada. A train will roll into the terminal, pick up containers directly from the ship, and carry them nonstop into the desert. Once these routes are up and running, Southern California will be able to forget about piles of cargo stacking up along the coast, and the ports will turn into clean transit hubs where nothing gets stuck. But let's say something similar to the 2021 logistics crisis happens again. In that case, would the Nevada port really be able to handle such a massive inflow of cargo? The Americans thought about that. Sure, the desert is huge, but you can't just drop a steel box onto the sand. It would simply sink in, and cranes aren't exactly going to drive across the dunes. That's why a massive construction project is now underway in Fernley. This inland port takes up a serious amount of land, about 91 hectares. To put it simply, that's well over 100 football fields. And to make sure this hub doesn't get overwhelmed by a flood of cargo during the next global maritime crisis, millions of dollars are now being poured into its expansion. The main feature of this upgrade is the rail infrastructure. They're laying around 20,000 feet of new railway tracks there. But why would you need that much track in the middle of the desert? Because it allows huge trains to enter the site in one piece without stopping or uncoupling the cars. A train arrives from the coast, rolls onto these endless tracks, automated cranes quickly unload the containers onto the ground, and the train immediately heads back to the sea for another batch of cargo. No congestion, no delays, just pure speed. On top of that, a new industrial terminal of almost 240,000 square feet is being built there right now, basically a giant indoor city for goods, with a whole network of loading docks so trucks can pick up the containers almost instantly. In other words, the U.S. is building this Nevada port with a huge safety margin for the future. If the West Coast gets hit by another disaster and California's ports are overwhelmed with containers, Fernley can act like a massive logistical shock absorber. It'll be able to take in thousands of containers almost instantly, spread them across its concrete lots, and keep American trade moving as if nothing had gone wrong at sea. Okay, so this helps take pressure off California's ports, but is there another effect this inland port creates? And the effect here is actually huge, and it has to do with ordinary highways. When you're hauling a giant metal box on a regular semi down the road, you always run into strict regulations. In the U.S., transportation authorities are very serious about this. There are limits on how much a truck can weigh. You can't just pack a container to the ceiling with heavy parts or machinery and send it down the highway. If the truck is too heavy, it'll damage the pavement, especially on bridges. That's monitored at special weigh stations, and if you're overloaded, the fine can be painful. Because of that, companies used to have to make ridiculous compromises. They would either underload containers, leaving a ton of empty space inside, or hire a bunch of extra trucks to spread out the weight. In short, it meant pure losses, more vehicles on the roads, and a lot more smoke in the air. Now look at a train heading to Nevada, or from Nevada to coastal ports for export. A train couldn't care less about those asphalt restrictions. Steel rails are steel rails. They're built to handle serious weight. As a result, containers can now be loaded much more efficiently, packed right up to the limit. So the benefit for the coast is clear. But all those containers that arrive at the port in Nevada don't just stay there forever, do they? What actually happens to them next? In Fernley, they came up with another clever trick, something logistics people call by the fancy word transloading. In simple terms, it just means moving cargo from one steel box into another. The whole world is used to shipping goods in standard shipping containers. These are the regular metal boxes that almost every cargo ship on the planet is built to carry. At sea, they're king. Everyone knows how to handle them. But once those goods arrive inside the United States, everything changes. It turns out that for domestic transport in America, these containers aren't the only option. For highway transport in the U.S., companies also use a different kind of beast, huge domestic trailers. They're much longer and spacious than standard ocean containers, So what happens in Fernley? They take an ocean container that's arrived from the coast by train, open it right there in the yard, and move all the goods into one of these giant American overland trailers. Why go through all that extra work and move things from one box to another? It may look like a waste of time, but in reality, this is where the big savings are hidden. The thing is, the cargo from 3 ocean containers can easily fit into just 2 large American trailers. So instead of sending 3 trucks farther across the country, you only send 2. That's the whole trick. With this simple move, companies can immediately cut their onward logistics costs across the U.S. by tens of %. You just move the goods into a bigger box, take 1 extra truck off the road, and save a ton of money. And that brings me to a question. Why choose Fernley? Why did this exact location get chosen for a new logistics hub? The answer is geography and some very powerful neighbors. Fernley wasn't chosen by accident. The town sits right next to a place called the Tahoe-Reno Industrial Center. It's usually shortened to TRIC, and in fact, it's the largest industrial park in the United States. This isn't some ordinary industrial zone on the edge of town. It's a massive stretch of desert where some of the richest companies in the world have built their factories and warehouses. This is where Tesla's famous Gigafactory is located. The same park also hosts huge distribution centers for Amazon, Google, Walmart, Panasonic, and the massive technology company Switch. Every day, all these giants need thousands of tons of components, chips, parts, and materials. Their supply chains have to run like clockwork because if production stops at facilities like these, companies can start losing millions by the minute. And this Port of Nevada in Fernley works almost like a private transport system for them. Instead of every factory struggling on its own to figure out how to drag cargo from the crowded ocean coast through California traffic, the Fernley hub takes care of the dirty work. Cargo from ships in California goes straight onto rail, moves quickly by train into Nevada, gets transloaded, and is then delivered to the factories at TRIC. What you get is a direct, polished delivery line carrying the necessary parts from the ocean almost to the doorstep of some of the world's most important manufacturing sites. Okay, so the containers go off to the companies that need what's inside them. But what happens next, once those steel boxes are empty? And this is where another huge problem begins, one that ordinary people rarely even think about. Logistics people have a fancy term for it, repositioning. In plain English, it simply means sending empty boxes back to Asia. A ship brings a pile of iPhones and sneakers from China to America. The containers are unloaded inside the country, and that's it. Now they're just sitting there empty. Meanwhile, Chinese factories need those same containers right now so they can pack new goods for the next shipment. So companies have to send those massive metal boxes back across the ocean. And running a giant ship filled with nothing but air is an absurdly expensive operation. Logistics companies spend billions of dollars a year on this, basically burning fuel for nothing. This is where the Port of Nevada pulls off another clever trick. Once a container's emptied at the yard in Fernley, nobody sends it back to the coast empty. Instead, it's handed over to local American farmers from Nevada and neighboring states, and farmers always have plenty of products that China's willing to buy in huge quantities. They take those empty boxes and pack them all the way to the top with agricultural goods. For example, soybeans or specially compressed hay. The Chinese are big buyers of this hay and import it in large volumes to feed their livestock. So in the end, you get a perfect loop. The container goes back toward the train and the ocean, not empty, but fully loaded to the brim. Logistics companies no longer have to pay to move air around. An empty box turns into a source of profit instead of pure loss, and American farmers get a cheap and convenient way to export their harvest to Asia. In other words, the Port of Nevada system is extremely effective and genuinely useful for the U.S. economy. And at this point, you can't help but wonder, are there any downsides at all to this rail and dry port system? The whole system does have one real downside, and it comes down to ordinary steel rails. The Port of Nevada isn't a typical seaport on the coast where a ship can just say, well, I've arrived, unload the cargo, and then hundreds of trucks scatter in every direction along any highway they want. It's more like one long, narrow thread with the entire local logistics system strung onto it. And that thread is the railroad. In other words, all these containers, trains, factories, and farmers may seem to be part of a cool, modern system, but in reality, everything depends on the rail line. For this port to show any signs of life at all, trains between California and Fernley have to keep running nonstop. And when your entire logistics chain is tied to a single rail route like that, any problem along the line instantly becomes a business disaster. For example, at the end of 2022, railroad workers in the U.S. decided to go on strike. And they didn't just quietly grumble about their problems, they came very close to bringing the entire national economy to a halt. So what happens to our dry port in the desert in that situation? It simply has to stop. The trains freeze, the tracks go quiet, new boxes stop arriving from the coast, and farmers can no longer ship their hay to Asia. In just one day, this huge high-tech hub turns into an ordinary, useless parking lot for piles of metal. Because moving millions of tons of cargo onto regular trucks is simply physically impossible. There just aren't that many available trucks and drivers. And that's the trap. Nevada may have a great port, but it doesn't work on its own. It makes you completely dependent on rails and train crews. And if that chain breaks, the whole system falls apart instantly. Still, the Port of Nevada has clearly shown that the U.S. can come up with practical, workable solutions to its logistics weak spots. Instead of spending decades trying to rebuild jammed coastal ports, they created a brilliant workaround in the desert, and it's already making a real difference for businesses.